Okay, well, can I welcome all of you and thank you for attending the third poetry Zoom reading for the Society of Classical Poets. I'm James Sale. I'm really privileged to be doing this. I've had some fabulous poets and readers before on the previous two sessions. Before I go any further, I ought to say something which I've said before, which is, who are the Society of Classical Poets, or what do they stand for? They are the world's premier organization for promoting, distributing classical poetry. What is classical poetry? Another word for this would be formal poetry. What is formal poetry? Formal poetry is the kind of poetry that uses forms, stanzaic forms, metrical forms, rhyme forms, literative forms, any kind of form. Or to put it another way, it's poetry that is not, or that is rather distinguishable from prose. And that informal poetry that doesn't use form is, of course, usually indistinguishable from prose. So the Society of Classical Poets defines itself in this very, very specific way. And we've called it classical because, of course, this kind of poetry that we like and we write goes back centuries. It's the great classics that we've loved from the past that has so much meaning in it that we keep returning to it time and time again. So each of these readings, these Zoom readings, this is the third one, has had a theme. The first one, the theme was the winners of the SCP 2021 competition. The second one was the issuing of the SCP Journal number 9 of the best poetry in 2021. And so if you, you can see I'm reading this book. If you haven't got this book, honestly, I strongly recommend it. I said a lot about it last time, so I won't go into it. It's 304 pages and blah, 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 but it's just jam-packed full of fabulous stuff. And there is an incredible benefit for you. If you turn to the back cover, you will see a picture of the romantic poet Andrew Benson Brown, photogenic Andrew Benson Brown in his full poetic glory. He's never been as famous as he is at this moment. And so just for Andrew Benson Brown, please make sure you get a copy. His whole future depends on it. Okay, so that's the book. Now, tonight, what's the theme? The theme tonight, of course, what else could it be? It's Christmas and New Year. And I have selected, with some input from others, but I have selected 8 poems for you to experience tonight, 4 on Christmas, 4 on the New Year, or topics therein contained, as it were. And we have 5 of the authors of the poems appearing with us tonight. That is, the authors, the poets themselves are going to read their own poems. And those particular 5, I shall be asking 1 or 2 questions of, so that I hope they're all ready for that, so that we can have a little bit of a dialogue about poetry and the craft of writing poetry, which is always so interesting. And then there will be 3 readings by poets who admire the work of these other poets who, for various reasons, can't be here tonight. And the first one I'll explain when we get to it, because I'm going to be reading that Bruce Wren's poem myself, and why he can't be here tonight will be pretty evident to you when I read his biography to you. So it's very, very clear. So it should be fun. At the end of this, we hope we can have some Q&A. And if you've got any questions, do text them up. Evan can't wait to get hold of them and throw them back at us. So that should be really good. So without further ado, let me introduce you to David Watt, who is a writer from Canberra, which he calls the bush capital of Australia. So we've gone a long way from America, a long way from England. He's a regular contributor to collections of poetry and prose by Robin Barrett. When it's not working for Intellectual Property Australia, he finds time to appreciate the intrinsic beauty of traditional rhyming poetry, as we all do. So I think this is a great start. It's a great start because in the UK, we call Australia down under. And for us, as I was saying to Evan just a moment ago, it's impossible to think of Christmas in England in the sunshine, in summer. It's just not normal. It's just so way out. It's like a gift we just simply never get here. It's the weather in England at the moment is absolutely dreadful. So I'm full of envy of David Watt, and even more so, his wonderful poem, Visions from Childhood, is about Christmas and the birth of Christ. And let's be frank about it, Christmas is especially special for children. And we especially remember our childhood and the magic, if we were lucky, our parents created for us about this wonderful time of presents and Thanksgiving. So before I get you to read the poem, David, let me give you a couple of questions. Firstly, could you tell us a little about the form of your poem? And welcome, by the way. Thank you for coming along to do this.
Thanks very much, James, for that wonderful introduction. The form of the poem is basically anapestic tetrameter. There's one anomaly in the poem, if you like. In the third quatrain actually has 2 extra lines in it. And I've mainly used iambic substitutions for the first foot of each line, primarily. And additionally, you'll notice in the poem that I have feminine endings for the first and third lines, and for that standout sort of stanza for the 5th line as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's wonderful.
It just developed as it went along as far as that odd stanza, but yeah, that's the basic form.
Yeah, it is wonderful. It's got a kind of complexity to it. I really enjoyed reading this. So tell me, you almost possibly alluded to this when you talked about the iambic substitutions, which you've made in the anapestic basic meter. But what challenges did you encounter by way of writing this?
Well, I think the biggest challenge probably is that, as Joe Cellini would say, it's a fictive article. And the storyline was perhaps the biggest challenge. The sequence of the events, making them logical, adding the descriptive elements. And although it is true I did swim with other children when I was young, I come from a very flat topographic area, an irrigation area in a place called Victoria. And there we had no mountains whatsoever, a very flat area. So the elements within the poem are basically fiction. Although my daughter does sing in a choir, she's a chorister for the Australian Girls Choir. So that's probably where that idea came from, and it was just developed from there.
Okay, well, that is fabulous. Well, let me invite you now, David, to give us your rendition of Visions from Childhood.
Thank you. Voices from Childhood. The play of the breeze brings the music of childhood, the tinkle of laughter as light and as clear, as were our voices when singing in Wildwood the day before Christmas, the best time of year. The songs that we sang told of sleigh bells a-jingling, snow-laden branches and manger with child, a reindeer named Rudolph with red nose a-tingling, from temperatures colder than our climate mild. Although we were strangers to reindeers and mangers, and sunscreen on noses was all that we knew, of summertime whiteness, apart from the brightness of clouds in a sea of cerulean blue, we sang with conviction in vow perfect diction, extolling his birth, which we knew to be true. Each chorister, following annual tradition, wore swimmers beneath formal trousers and robes. But though the townsfolk knew our layered condition, the height of our folly resisted all probes. For when the last notes faded into the distance, we packed up our songbooks with danger in mind, to head to the river, whose lilting insistence had drawn us to waters, the treacherous kind. Before you could say Silent Night or King Wenceslas, we divested the vestments of coral attire, on bordering fences, positions defenceless, from flurries of dust and the rust stain of wire. From cliffs high enough to see mountain tops showing, we leapt to the ribbon of silver below, until our resistance to hunger pangs growing drifted away like a leaf in the flow. Boastful, bedraggled, still dripping, we straggled back home after donning our gear for the way. Dismissive of bruising, self-confidence oozing, outdoing each other in swagger and sway. And these are the scenes that my memories bring whenever December the 24th nears. The pleasure of touching the skies with our singing, delighting in danger and brushing off the ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I love it. I love it. I think I always feel that there's something about a natural poet when you you catch it. Actually, Jarvis Bryant does this a lot. Internal rhyming. Coleridge does it in The Ancient Mariner quite a lot. And Edgar Allan Poe does it. This kind of effortless ability. Somehow the words catch you and you do it. Is there a favourite line that you have in that poem, David?
I think the favourite line would be the bedraggled. Boastful, bedraggled, still dripping, we straggled.
So
it sort of rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, you've got the internal.
It's descriptive. Yeah, sorry, it's descriptive of the way of the scene.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Actually, my favourite line is we sang with conviction in vowel perfect diction, extolling his birth, which we knew to be true. So you have the internal rhyme, but I had to include the second line because I actually feel there's something profound. I mean, one of the tragedies of the modern period, surely, is that children are being disabused of the imagination of the reality of Santa Claus and Father Christmas, and actually being allowed to know an imaginative truth long before they actually really should be asking these questions. And I think that, children know the Christmas story to be true in an intuitive way that is, not reasonable. It's all part of that innocence that childhood has. And I think you capture that brilliantly well. So I love those lines. Very, very good indeed. So thank you very much. Thanks for turning up. Thanks for reading it. It's been a wonderful experience. Now, we move on to, and I've actually got to do something myself here. Sadly, a good friend of mine couldn't quite make it, was going to read this for me, but he had a very important other engagement. He had a 7-year-old grandson that had to be dealt with. So I'm going to read this myself. It's by Father Bruce Wren, and it's called Under Christmas Eve. So we're approaching Christmas, sort of. Father Bruce Wren, I'm going to give you a brief bio for him because you'll understand why he couldn't read it himself tonight. So try and work it out from just this bio. Father Bruce Wren, born in the small town of Cottonwood, Idaho, currently serves as chaplain of the Chicago chapter of the Lumen Institute, section director to the Chicago Regnum Christi Men's Section, chaplain to the Catholic Professionals of Illinois, spiritual director for many religious and lay people, and helps regularly at several parishes in the Chicago Diocese. He also devotes regular time to the feminine congregations of the Missionaries of Charity, the Little Sisters of the Poor, and the Rosary Hill Dominican Sisters. He has published one book of poetry, Fending Off the Dragon Fire, available at Amazon. Now, I ask you to work it out. Why do you think a guy like that can't appear today to do a reading for us? And the answer, of course, is it's Sunday. These people, these fathers and these vicars and these priests, they get very busy on a Sunday. And with this kind of sea view of people he's helping out, I'm surprised he's even got time to write poetry, to be quite honest. But he does. And he's written an absolute corker. And it's a beautiful 14-line Petrarchan sonnet. And if you know Petrarchan sonnets, they're very difficult to write. They're more difficult to write than Shakespearean sonnets, although in certain contexts, it's better to use Shakespearean. Depends on the purpose. But in this instance, what's difficult about Petrarchan sonnets is the number of rhymes you need to have. And this is particularly magical. And I ask you and invite you to notice the word weave, because actually the word weave and its rhyme words creates a kind of magical spell as you go through the sonnet. So Under Christmas Eve by Father Bruce Wren. Once more beneath this starry night, my lord, beneath the purple eaves that winters weave, within these dreams that speak your silent word, and all those dreams to which my heart would cleave, I search again on this new Christmas Eve, a love uncovered from a hidden hoard, a newborn child that bids those dreams to leave, or eyes that long ago once loved me, Lord. It's these I seek for in this starry light, and though my heart forever stays the same, it's wonderful that in this world of change, some things, like stars upon a Christmas night, as if your angel messengers, so strange, can tame my blushing cheeks and my heart aflame. That's a really wonderful Petrarchan sonnet, isn't it? Father Bruce Wren. I hope he gets to appreciate and see your appreciation to his marvelous sonnet. Now, I'm hoping he's online at the moment. I'm not sure oh, I think he is. My next guest is an old friend of mine. We met up in New York in 2019. We performed together in the park. He's a wonderful guy. And he also came on one of the other Zoom readings that we did. I couldn't resist it. He's such, well, I love him to bits, but he won't mind. He's such a lovely wacko, really. I just love his kind of really strange poetry style of writing. He does some brilliant things. And he's got such an original title for this poem, Make Christmas a Verb. Now, that's a pretty original title, isn't it? Just in itself, Make Christmas a Verb. So Mark, and let's be exact about it, Mark F. Stone grew up near Seattle, Washington. After graduating from Brandeis University and Stanford Law School, he worked as an attorney for the United States Air Force for 33 years. You'd never believe it looking at him now, though, would you? He served 11 years as an active duty Air Force JAG attorney. He then served 22 years as an Air Force civilian attorney while serving part-time in the Air Force Reserves as a JAG attorney. He began writing poems in 2005 as a way, now note this very carefully, to woo his bride-to-be into wedlock. He recently retired, giving him time to focus on poetry. He lives in central Ohio, but there's a question which he hasn't answered. He's cleverly sidestepping that bio. And you know what the question is, don't you? Well, if the purpose of writing the poetry was to win the bride, and he's won the bride, what is his purpose for writing poetry now? So let's welcome Mark F. Stone. Great that you're with us, Mark. And have you got an answer to that question? I know it's a bit of a surprise to you, but what's the purpose now, man?
Well, James, actually, thank you for inviting me to this event. And I would say the surprise was that you didn't ask the question I thought you were going to ask. Because my bio says I wrote the poems in an effort to persuade my then girlfriend to marry me. But the question is, did she do so? Okay, and the answer to that question is yes. And now I've forgotten your question. No, why am I writing poetry now? I would say just to bring joy to others, or to vent my frustration at political topics, or just maybe to try to bring joy or amusement to people.
Okay. Well, you didn't mention your soul there, so that's I was quite refreshed that you didn't mention your deep inner soul there. That was it. Bringing joy to people is a very good thing, especially at Christmas time. So tell us about the form of your poem, Making Christmas a Verb.
Okay, well, it's trimeter, which I like to use. That's my favorite type of meter. And so all the lines are either an iamb followed by 3 anapaests, or 3 dactyls followed by an extra syllable, or 3 dactyls followed by 2 extra syllables, i.e. a feminine ending. I hope you don't hear my Australian Shepherd barking in the background. If you do, as I just did, I apologize.
But
okay.
David Watt loves it. David's from Australia. That's going to make him feel very comfortable. You're Australian, do what it wants to do, man.
All right, fair enough. And so, yes, so trimeter, that's the form.
Okay, and what challenges did you encounter along the way with this?
Okay, so the poem is made up of rhyming couplets, and one goal I had was to have the exact same meter in each line of the rhyming couplets. Another goal I had was to have at least a couple of feminine endings, because a poem with all, male endings, this is kind of boring to me. And so, so I have a couple couplets with feminine endings. Of course, I wanted to have no inversions, because if I have an inversion, that means I just, in my opinion, I haven't worked hard enough to remove that or work around it. I do like to try to have colorful rhymes. And also I have one double rhyming couplet. So so the 4th syllable of each line rhymes, as well as the final word. And then my standard checklist, I've got one simile and a bunch of alliterations and examples of assonance and consonants. So that's basic. Oh, and finally, I try not to write too much. I originally had 24 lines, but then cut it back to 16, which when you're going in triple trimeter, that line, maybe 16 lines of trimeter might be equivalent to 20 lines of iambic pentameter. So I think it's long enough. I just didn't want to go too long.
Okay, well, fabulous account. I love it. Actually, we're getting a very technical bunch tonight, aren't we? We're getting some real technical stuff. And I think the whole thing that the Society of Classical Poets does on its web pages, where we get so many informed comments about what is going on technically in poems, is really sort of like osmosis going through to everybody. Everyone's sort of getting quite technical. I've got some technical things to say in a minute. But anyway, Mark F. Stone, make Christmas a verb for us. Let's have the reading.
Make Christmas a verb. For many, the gifts are the be-all and end-all. The big screen, the tablet, the Barbie and Ken doll. For me, gifts I get are like ice in the sun. I cannot recall them. No, not even one. How did I find a true way to remember the import of each 25th of December? The quest to acquire is an urge one can curb. The lesson I learned was make Christmas a verb. Knock on the door of your neighbors who deal with aging and loneliness. Bring them a meal. If you have means and you live in fine fettle, drop off some greens in that little red kettle. Visit our vets who are hurt and express your thanks for their service as they convalesce. Deliver to others a luminous glow. The gifts you will cherish are those you bestow.
Fabulous, fabulous. I love it. I love it. And what's your favorite line, Mark?
Well, it's actually the first two lines because, and I'll just read them. The end rhyme on both of those is perhaps my favorite rhyme I've ever written on any poem. And I actually remember where I was and what I was doing when that rhyme occurred to me. I was actually walking the Australian Shepherd around the block. And I remember exactly the point on the street where we were with that rhyme, because you run the poem through your head as you're doing whatever. And so it came to me right there. And anyway, okay, so the two lines are, for many, the gifts are the be-all and end-all, the big screen, the tablet, the Barbie and Ken doll.
Yeah, funny, they are my favorite lines as well. And I've actually made a note of it. And I was going to say to you, if I'd have searched for 100 years, I couldn't have found that rhyme. It's such an unusual rhyme. It is a genius Byronic rhyme. We've got a lot of great rhymers in the SCP, but that's one of those great rhymes. Of course, there is a problem with it, though. And you know what the problem is, don't you? You've given your strongest punch at the beginning. Most people want to get it at the end. So there's always that to think about. There's the beginning of the poem. Hey, this rhymes. Mind you, you do have some other great rhymes, but that is so unusual. I have to say, I love it. I love it.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for that reading. It's absolutely wonderful, Mark. And I've got to move on, though, because now our last poem about Christmas, a little bit political, I've got to say, but it shouldn't surprise you. It comes from our great friend, Evan Mantyk, who's written a psalm of Christmas, or as he calls it, what the heart of the young activist said to the psalmist. So can you see the young activist, the psalmist, the young activist, the now, the psalmist, then, the old, the new, the contrast. So Evan is bringing in a fresh dimension to this kind of old topic, as it were. To read you a long biography of Evan would be really tedious because we all know him so well, but he's an English teacher and poet living in New York, and I was privileged to meet him back in 2019 when I met Mark. He's also famous as the co-founder and editor of the Society of Classical Poets. So, Evan, tell us about the form of this poem.
So this poem is really, I'm not sure what the technical term is, but it's modeled after a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the great American poet, called A Psalm of Life. And so his poem is subtitled, What the Heart of the Young Man Said to the Psalmist. So mine is What the Heart of the Young Activist Said to the Psalmist. And actually, I was an activist earlier in my life when I was younger. So I basically lifted his form, and his poem begins with certain lines, and mine are very similar but a little bit different. So a lot of people do they'll do model poems after the Raven, Poe's Raven, and a lot of other poems, really famous poems, people will kind of mimic them. So this is my mimicking kind of poem, I guess. It's not a parody, it's not really humorous, but it's kind of along those lines.
It is humorous, but it's very heartfelt as well. So it's very intensely serious. So go for it, Evan. Let's hear the poem.
Okay. A Psalm of Christmas, what the heart of the young activist said to the psalmist. Tell me not in boring numbers about today's economy, for our consciences grow number and then become our enemy. Money's fake, just an idea. It's a value agreed to give. It's a home, clothes, and a meal. It's a means, not an end to live. Not an end after won elections, nor university degrees, but to awaken populations whose thirst for truth will never cease. Money's built on more ideas, like on what is living well. Does it involve clean air and trees, or does it make someone's life hell? Do we care our Christmas lights are made by prisoners of conscience, tortured and deprived of rights that we value, or is this nonsense? What about discrimination that occurs outside our borders in a trading partner nation from which our shelves are mail ordered? The Falun Gong practitioner is the silent elephant, crucified with modern horror we all knowingly permit. We can't not buy made in China, but we can speak loud our minds, letting ring a hopeful cheer that makes our lives a bit sublime. Let us then speak loud and strong words that echo truth and cheer. Merry Christmas, free Falun Gong, and have a prosperous new year.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you very much. Very, very heartfelt indeed. And so let me ask you the question, what is your favorite line in that poem?
I like the one about the Falun Gong practitioners, the silent elephant. So this practice persecuted in China. I wrote the poem 8 years ago, actually. And so at that time, people hadn't heard of like the Uyghurs being persecuted. And it was kind of like the Chinese Communist Party started with Falun Gong and people kind of just ignored it. And now it's ballooned into this huge thing with the Uyghurs and the genocide and Hong Kong. And so, it was that kind of thing that nobody really addressed before. And now it's blown out of proportion now. And, everybody realizes.
I love the fact you've given us something totally different from what has gone before, and it's all valid, and poetry can cover all this stuff with these intense feelings. My own favorite line, however, is very different, and it's quite a technical point, but what I particularly like here is the line, for our consciences grow number. And the reason I like that is because it rhymes with tell me not in boring numbers. When you think about it, you've actually used a hyphen to emphasize it, though you didn't need to do it. But numbers and number, if you look at it, apart from the plural, are actually a perfect rhyme, except they're not, because the pronunciation is just slightly off. And it's like, you've actually, the consciences are kind of like hidden. We're so full of the numbers, we think, we don't realize we've become number. And so there's a very subtle shift that you're using through the technical aspect of the rhyme. It's a ingenious, not obvious rhyme that seems to have a very profound meaning in terms of what is hidden and what we actually hear with our ears. So it looks the same, things look the same, numbers, but actually the slight shift in sound, when you really listen, you find the truth is quite different. So I think it's a really clever technical aspect of what you've done. So I love these technical points. They are so good. Now, thank you, Evan Mantyk. You're a gem. Carry on doing your marvelous work with the SCP. But we now have to move from Christmas to something else, the new year. And again, there's a change of pace because we have another marvelous poet who is very technically adept. In fact, this particular poem I could comment on extensively about technical features, but I won't do that for now. But I'm talking about the new year by Adam Sedia. So just to introduce Adam, Adam lives in his native, I met him briefly, by the way, again in 2000. I met these important people. If I haven't met you yet, just imagine it's a treat that's awaiting you. I will meet you one day soon. It's got to happen. It's inevitable. It's fate. Adam lives in Northwest Indiana with his wife, Ivana, and their children, and practices law as a civil and appellate litigator. In addition to the Society's publications, his poem and prose works have appeared in the Chain Muse Review, Indiana Voice Journal, and other literary journals. He is also a composer, and his musical works may be heard on his YouTube channel. So that's Adam Sedia. So can I welcome Adam? It's fabulous you could be here with us. It's really great to have you and this wonderful poem that you've written. So could you tell us a bit about the form of your poem?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, this is in quatrains. It's in iambic trimeter. The first and third lines of every stanza have feminine ending and are blank. That is, they don't rhyme. And then the second and fourth lines have masculine ending and they rhyme AABB, varying every stanza.
Okay. And what difficulties did you have writing this?
Well, this is what we call an open form poem, which is each stanza has a set formula, but there's no set number of lines for the poem, like say in a sonnet. So when you're dealing with open form, the challenge is always the same in prose, is knowing when to stop. There's saying too much. Less is more is true in prose as in poetry. I've found, and I think you want to say what you want to say, but you don't want to say too much. This poem I wrote, I was actually on the road from my home to Springfield, Illinois for work. And if you know anything about the area, it's just miles and miles of empty, flat cornfields. And in winter, this was shortly after the new year. It's all just fallow fields and patches of snow. And as your mind starts wandering, trying not to fall asleep on the road, you get the idea. So it was what's going to come forth. The seeds are planted, everything's going to burst forth in the new year, and how to say that without saying too much.
Yeah, well, actually, what you've just said in a way echoes Mark F. Stone as well, with the problem of cutting back, excising, and being quite ruthless with prolixity. So I think that's a very interesting. Two of you both commented on that now. So that's a lesson for all of us all the time. Are we saying too much? So can you now, Adam, read your poem, The New Year? Adam Sedia, The New Year.
With pleasure. The New Year. The fields stretch out, bare, icy, wide, blank, yet unetched slates, tabulae rasae, waiting, the chisel of the fates. But deep beneath their starkness, a mighty force has stirred, the germ of the becoming, unknown, unseen, unheard. Its course is set in motion, that none may stop or stall. The seeds sown and forgotten must sprout, bloom, fruit, and fall. What shoots will break the furrows, coaxed by the waxing sun? What harvest will they proffer when the sun's course has run? For now they hold their secret, they tease the guessing eyes, which only gaze in wonder and fear at what shall rise.
It's a very wonderful poem. And what is your favorite line in it?
Well, I have two. The first one is the germ of the becoming, because that kind of encapsulates what the poem is about. And then more technically, I also like the line coaxed by the waxing sun, because you have an alliteration with the letter X, which you don't see too often.
You don't see it too often. Well, that's fabulous. Well, let me share with you. In fact, my favorite line, although I'm going to agree with you on your favorite line, but for another reason, but my favorite line is the chisel of the fates. That is a wonderful, wonderful line. The fates with a capital F, of course, and the sense of something engraved in stone that just cannot be broken. The word chisel there is just perfect. But talking of technical things, I also like the germ of the becoming. And the reason I like that and why that is such a brilliant line is because you've actually got a stress on the word the. Now, that's a very unusual thing to find. You know, you've got such a strong propulsive iambic beat that you end up stressing the word the, even when normally that would not be a word that you would stress. And the genius of it is, of course, it's the German, the becoming. The hasn't become a stress word. It's kind of implicit in it, but because of its position, it's going to have one. So it's kind of like mimetic in its effect that you've actually made the word the a non-stress word, a stress word in a sentence about becoming. So I think that is really very, very clever indeed. So that is a marvelous poem, and thank you for sharing it with us. And of course, we do, of course, fear what shall rise, and with what's going on in the world. I mean, who doesn't, as we face 2022, have that sense of more COVID stuff, more wars, more persecutions. It's just, isn't it just dreadful? So it's a very, very relevant poem for today. Thank you very much, Adam, for that. That's
Thank you.
Wonderful. So we move on, and now we come to, geez, I can't believe my luck. We come on to another favorite person of mine, the wonderful, the sublime, the awesome Susan Jarvis Bryant, who's been on before and is such a hit. Of course, we have to have her on again. She writes consistently wonderfully technical poems. That's the thing about her work. There's so much technical stuff going on, both in meter and in rhyme and in form. So it's difficult to pick something. But this particular poem is called My New Year's Revolution, not resolution, notice, my revolution. So it's a little bit, you know, a bit like Evan, a bit edgy. Susan herself is a church secretary and poet whose homeland is Kent, England, where, of course, I came from. So we bond on that, Kent, don't we? And she is now an American citizen living on the coastal plains of Texas with her lovely husband, Mike. Susan's poetry published, there he goes, Santa Claus himself. Susan's poetry published in the UK webzine, Lighten Up Online, the Daily Mail, very prestigious paper in the UK, and Openings, anthologies of poems by the Open University Poets. And of course, she is widely disseminated on the SCP site. So first, tell us, welcome, Susan. Tell us about the form.
Well, the form is just, it's written in an iambic pentameter, and it's 5 quatrains of A-B, A-B rhymes with a closing punchline couplet. So just simple, really.
Okay, and what issues, challenges did you have when you wrote it in particular? I mean, I happen to know of one because we had some exchange about this, so you can be free with everyone.
I had to tweak it a little for this year because I wrote it last year, sort of inspired by my dismay at not being able to travel to Munich to see my son and have Christmas with my family. So it was brought on in a fit of pique. So whenever that happens to me, I shut myself away in a room and write a poem instead of going on to Mike, you know.
You're getting out of yourself. Okay, well, that's fabulous then. So I know it's a revised version and fabulous for this year. So please, Susan Jarvis Bryant, give us your New Year's revolution.
Okay. If I'd pranced off on Friday nights and parted, quaffed shots and danced in sequin spun array, I'd quit such excess, but it never started. I've spent the best of 2 years locked away. If I had fine dined at the downtown bistro and grown a little tubby round the tum, I'd forego munching on their mango gatto. But since the bistro's bust, that vow's undone. If I had booked vacations and I'd travelled to balmy destinations far and wide, I'd curb my carbon footprints. They skedaddled when flights to palmy beaches were denied. If I could conjure close time with my family, a cosy day where kindred spirits beam, I'd pledge to revel in their gleeful company. Now Omicron has trodden on that dream. If I could bless this new year with some sparkle, I'd end this never-ending COVID buy-in. But since I can't buff up this vile debacle, I'm polishing my inner pacing lion. If one more numbskull calls me non-essential, I'll pose a roaring threat that's existential.
Thank you so much. And what is your favourite line in that poem? I know what mine is.
Well, I like the first two, not for the image, you know, prancing off on Friday nights and being in dancing in sequin-spun array. That is nothing like me at all.
I can see you now in that. It is you.
I think it sets it up well, you know.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you what I think your best line in that is. In my opinion, it's I love the line, "I'm polishing my inner pacing lion." And there's alliteration there, but the alliteration is what I would call oxymoronic. I mean, how do you polish a lion?
Yeah.
The lion by its very nature is savage, untamed, it's leaping at you. So what you're actually getting in that sort of weird oxymoronic image is you are suppressing your reason is suppressing your whole instinctual being, which is like a lion, and it's just about got the lid on it, but it could just explode. And the oxymoronic tension of those two words, with the lion as a central image, I think brilliantly conveys that explosive inner turmoil that you are in. So I love that.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're getting near the end, and I've got to move on again. And this time we're on to a poem by Connie Phillips called Lights. And Connie Phillips is a former English teacher and editor living in Massachusetts. And she can't be here with us tonight, but the great Andrew Benson Brown, you know, the Missouri poet laureate, I hope in waiting, perhaps, who knows, greatness awaits him. He has offered to read this. He's a brilliant reader of poetry anyway. And if you haven't read his Legends of Liberty, a masterpiece, please find it on Amazon. It's there. So Andrew Benson Brown, where are you? Oh, there you are. Thank you for coming and being prepared to read. Lights by Connie Phillips. I'd like you to give us a reading of it now, please.
I should say, by way of comment, there is some construction going on outside my house right now due to a broken water main flooding my driveway, so I hope that it's not too bad. It seems to have died down here, thankfully, for the moment, so I'm taking advantage of that. Here, I need to adjust my necklace. The necklace may seem perhaps excessively festive here, but it is pertinent to the poem if I can get it working here, which it just was. Ah. There we are. Yes. Okay. Lights by Connie Phillips. The shining Santas smile in silver sleighs, with dazzling reindeer poised on roofs midair. The phosphorescent elves stare in a daze, while shimmering tinsel hangs from angels' hair. The flashing lights, the lamps and laser beams illuminate the buildings, every place. The lights so bright they blind us in our dreams, their blazing patterns visible from space. When all the glitz and glitter disappear, as holidays come quickly and then go, when plugs are pulled, a day beyond New Year, and dark descends amidst the cold and snow. The light of kindness glows eternally in human hearts for God and heaven to see.
Oh, yes. Very, very beautiful. I love that poem for the hope it radiates. And in fact, the hope it radiates is even in the title, Lights. It's a fabulous reading. I love the buffoonery of those lights you've got around your neck, Andrew Benson Brown. That's totally very funny, but the majesty of the poem came across very clearly. So I think that is absolutely wonderful. So we come to the last poem. Before I introduce this, can I just say to you, if you've got questions to ask about any of this or any of us, it doesn't have to be about me, it could be about anybody, any of the poems or any of the readers, feel free to text Evan so we have something at the end. That would be a good thing to think about now. And so we come on to the last poem, which is a strangely mystical, wonderful hymn-like poem called "O Thou Fount of Joy, I Praise Thee" by Scath Beohr. And Scath Beohr is a writer of Ulster and Cherokee ancestries whose books include the high fantasy novel Black Fox in Thin Places, the story collections Children and Other Wicked Things, and always After Thieves Watch. the fantasy novel October House, and the poetic study Dark Sayings of Old. Raised in New Orleans and West Florida, and having made trips to India and Ireland, he now makes a home with his joyful and imaginative wife, Ember, in a quaint turn-of-the-century neighborhood on the Atlantic coast of Florida. So we have a traveler by any other name, haven't we? A guy that's been moving around quite a lot. And this is, you know, we've heard the Chisel of Fates from Andy and Sedia in that ominous night, but now we have a deep spiritual light appearing and a wonderful end with Scott's yearning note for the light, which my son, Joseph Sale, is about to read for us. And just briefly, Joseph is a novelist and poet himself. And, you know, I've mentioned he's my son for the avoidance of doubt. Please don't put this down to nepotism. He is actually a wonderful reader. I've seen him read many times live before. So see for yourself. No pressure, Joe. And one final note about my son, Joseph. He's 28. His first major poem is being published on Amazon this coming Tuesday. I read the proof version of it. It's a brilliantly conceived continuation of Edmund Spenser's unfinished epic, The Fairy Queen, entitled Virtue's End. I love it. So if you fancy, take a look. So, Joseph Sale, could you read for us, O thou fount of joy, I praise thee? Isn't that wonderful? I love that line.
Thank you, and it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here among such excellent and admirable poets. Truly some amazing readings tonight. One thing to say just before I do read it is this is the kind of poem that makes me wish that I had a wonderful singing voice, and I actually think that to hear this poem sung would be the absolute best way to enjoy it, because it is based on the hymn by Robert Robinson, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, which was written in 1758. So unfortunately, I do not have a wonderful singing voice, so I will not be able to deliver it in that manner, but I will do my best. And those of you who know the hymn will perhaps hear the same rhythm and meter that is used in the original. O thou fount of joy, I praise thee. In my dark night, he brought his joy by an ancient melody. I was young then, did not know that what he taught me by degree was a way to remain with him when the storms of each new year gathered o'erhead in defiance, as if death were that to fear. Then came time for valediction, and I wandered from his sight. I was dragged then hither, thither, till my eyes could find no light. Every path which first seemed easy later proved to be a mire. Then I heard him softly, clearly, calling me home from my dire circumstances, false romances, hateful word and hateful hand. For my fear had made me wonder if there truly was a land filled with joy and readied for the one submitting all to love. Had I listened and not trusted in myself, but looked above, I would have seen there in my sorrow that a kingdom overlays this dark valley where death lingers, disappearing in our praise. O thou fount of joy, I humbly give my very life to thee. Use me as thou will and guide me every step till I will be in thy presence, there to never leave again thy sweet embrace. I am saddened for believing in a lesser source of grace. O my shepherd, how I love thee, I now give my all to thee. Waking, sleeping, I am yearning that thy light burn bright in me.
Wonderful poem, wonderful reading. Thank you very much, Joe. That was absolutely fabulous. So we have reached the end of our 8 poems and our 8 readers. It's been a feast, I think, absolutely. It seems to me each of these sessions, Zoom sessions, go from strength to strength. We seem to get better and better, and it's wonderful to see this progression occurring. So are there any questions that people, or any issues, points that people want to make about this, that I'd like to say? I haven't looked at the chat room. I think Evan's looking. Is there anything we need to comment on, Evan, at all?
Well, Mark's posed his the same questions he posed before. Actually, Mark, you can go ahead and, yeah, I see you're unmuted. Go ahead and talk.
Yes, 2 questions I'm always interested in, and I raised these 2 questions at a previous poetry reading led by you, James, and Susan answered them, and she's not required to answer the same questions again. But just for those who have not answered, if you're willing to share, question number 1, how do you obtain review of your draft poems before sending them out for publication? You know, like having a friend review it or being in a review group. I'm just curious what the personal practice is, if you're willing to share your trade secret. Second, how do you know when a poem is done, quote unquote, and ready to send out for publication? Those are the 2 questions.
I will comment here that for people who are members of the society, when they send me something and I don't think it's done or they need to work on it, then I'll, tell them. So in some cases, I think I'm part of the process. And, sometimes I'll advise them on ways to fix the poem or tell them I think it's not done yet or something. So one way to do it is to just send it to me. But yeah, that's just...
And I will comment, I sent a lengthy poem to Evan a little over a year ago, and he made 3 or 4 suggestions, all of which I adopted, one which was really, really good, and I couldn't figure out how to fix the problem, but he gave me a wonderful suggestion. And so, yeah, he gave me 3 or 4 excellent suggestions on that poem. So thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like, I commented last time, I remember commenting on this, so I'm not going to comment again.
Yeah.
But is there anybody else here who would like to give Mark the wisdom of their experience on this? Because he's genuinely interested, and he's very persistent as well. He's got 2 questions and he wants them answered, and he wants them answered now. So, if you've got any ideas for Mark, now's the time to speak up. It would be very helpful for him.
Well, and the reason I ask is the method I've been using in
Mark,
in the past.
Mark, Adam is going to answer. So say no more. Adam is saying something. Here we go. Adam.
Well, I don't mind sharing what I do. In my experience, if you want external input, most publications that are worth their salt are not bashful about sharing what they think needs to be edited. But as far as internal review, I used to be in review groups and things, and the more people you have, I think the more it dilutes your voice. So what I like to do is when I finish the first draft of a poem, I set it aside and I don't look at it. And it could be for a few days. Usually it's about a month or 2, and then I get back to it, and it's amazing. I always have one of 2 reactions. Either I wrote that or I wrote that, and then that tells you if it's ready to go out or if it needs more work. I think just setting it aside and approaching it like a new work is the best thing.
I like that answer a lot, Mark, and you can respond to it. And I like it particularly because I think the danger with writing groups is you start trying to write poems by committee and pleasing everybody. And I think you're right. You dilute your own original voice. I think there's something about poets that has to be, it comes from within. It's inspired by the muse. And yes, people, my son, for example, has corrected some lines that I've done, and I'm happy for that. But it hasn't changed the central, I'm not in a committee discussing it with him. Oh, how can I do this? No, read this. Here are some comments. Fine. What's valid about that? So I think Adam is correct in what he's saying. So how do you feel about that?
Oh, thank you, Adam. No, that makes good sense to me.
Anything else? Anybody else like to come in? I mean, you've never usually been shy, Andrew Benson Brown. I mean, you feeling a bit shy today, are we, or what? A bit bashful? Too much noise in the background? I mean, what's going on?
Oh, not at all. No, no. Well, I can't speak for Connie Phillips, of course. I like Adam's idea. I do that too. Set it aside for a little bit. Usually it's just a few days, although I'm kind of an obsessive editor. So it'll be like a few days and then a few days later and then a few days later. And maybe then, who knows, months after that. But so, yeah, I mean, usually you get to a point, I think, where you just feel like it's maybe sufficiently complete. Although that's not even 100% true because, yeah, still I might be editing it way down the road. But yeah, I think the setting it aside is a great idea. Also, yeah, the whole committee thing too. A lot of these, the way that the universities do it is kind of like a peer review process sort of thing. They apply that to poetry, and I think it just doesn't work at all. It's a terrible idea. But a much more individual thing. I mean, you need your kind of your informal group like this, maybe get a feedback from a few people. Of course, Evans edited my work too, giving me suggestions for stuff. That's always helpful. I think I pretty much always take his advice. So maybe having a few people comment on it rather than a committee.
People you trust, basically, people you trust and respect, who've got your interests at heart. I mean, that is the key thing for all this, really. I think all of us need, don't we? And in fact, the SCP is itself part of this larger framework of a society, a framework of despite the odd spats, but a framework of friends who are well-intentioned. It's very important we're well-intentioned towards each other because we're all trying to achieve something which the modern poetry world is trying to not achieve. They're trying to do exactly the reverse of what we're doing. And there's a political reason why they're doing it, because with the free verse goes really a kind of casual amorality, a casual lack of principle, a casual sort of, it's all about me and what I think happens to be brilliant. And it abandons standards in a quite dramatic way. And we don't like that. We all like standards, and we all like quality, and we all like craftsmanship, and we all like, these things that the society represents in what it's producing. So in a sense, we are a community, and within that community, each of us will find various people that we particularly get on with and particularly chime with, and others perhaps less so. But it's a very large community now, so there's a lot there to pick from. So that is really very exciting.
I could just add one thing, if I may.
Yeah, please do, Jim.
As I'm traveling along the Columbia River on the north
Don't
side
fall
of
in.
Oregon, I don't have a lot of personal connections with people that really even understand formal poetry, and their advice when they hear my poems is either to say they like it, or why don't I shorten or take this line out or something, which makes no sense at all. I find that I have to sort of submit things somewhat blindly, and Evan is wonderful. He catches me where I'm short a beat on something that I didn't catch. He's very helpful in those ways. But really, my input is from the society itself. When I have an item published, I get corrected occasionally with punctuation, which I don't.
We've lost you, Jim.
Yeah, can't hear Jim.
I can't hear you, Jim. Have you not fallen in the river, have you?
Maybe he went under a bridge.
You've gone under a bridge, Jim.
We do have another question from Susan, although Jim still looks like he's talking.
Can we come back to you, Jim? I think his camera looks like it's slowing down, actually.
I hope he's not having.
Can I add my 2 cents to this question?
Please do, Martin.
Yes. Well, one thing I'll do sometimes when I've written a poem and maybe it seems complete, but there's one stanza or a couplet that just doesn't feel right, what I'll try to do is write several versions of the line in question and, go back and read aloud the stanza and just get a feel for which one seems to flow better, which has a stronger rhythm, a more consistent meter. And then I'll read it to my wife or my daughter. And, because I want it to pass the sound test, after, as well as in the sense, because poetry is such a spoken art, and so I want it to make it so that it sounds like it's flowing, and so I'll read maybe 4 versions of a line, and then just by reading it aloud, I'll gradually maybe set it aside, come back to it, and I'll gradually come to see which one feels like it flows better. It's hard to
actually, Mantyk, that's a very profound point you're making. The point about poetry as a sound art. One of the problems with the 20th century, and I don't wish to deride imagery, we all need imagery, but of course its emphasis early on in the 20th century on imagery, as if imagery alone was defining what poetry was about. I mean, Pound and all these people, and the Imagist movement has percolated poetry so that the sound has become completely incidental. But if you want to move the heart as opposed to have the head understand something, you have to have sound. That's why music, which is the purest form of sound, is so powerful. And what we want our poetry to do is to approach music, not in terms of bibble babble sounds, but as with Coleridge, where something like Kubla Khan is so melodic to read. It's incredible. You become hypnotized by the sound. So thinking about the sound of your poetry is a really profound activity that one needs to undertake. It's something we could run workshops on sound and what that really means. And it's why iambic is so important. All the meters are important, but iambic is especially important because it reflects the basic pattern of the language, which is definite article, noun, pronoun, verb, preposition, noun. You think about it, we've got all these inbuilt iambics in the language itself. It's why people accidentally start writing iambics. A turn or two, I'll walk to still my beating mind. The Tempest. A turn or two, I'll walk to still my beating mind. You have there the simplest of language, and yet for somebody who's gone through, as proselytized, this total mental agitation, and then the language resolves it in this straight iambic beat. It's fabulous writing. So you're absolutely right. Sound is critical.
Yes.
I've got something that I can add as well, if that's okay. Just in my personal experience.
Sorry, who's speaking?
This is Steve. It's a Steve Todd. Hi.
Oh, hi, Steve.
Hello. Yeah, what I was going to say. I mean, for myself, I found that reading the stuff to my wife, who's got an English degree as well, but most of the time I find that when I read things to her, it's not necessarily that she has to make any comment. The act of me reading it out to her quite often makes me go, that bit doesn't work, does it? So sometimes it's just the act of actually saying it out loud, as you say. It's looking at the actual craft of the sound itself as to whether it actually survives the rubber meeting the road, as they say. But I must admit, I think it's probably interesting to look at in terms of feedback and drafting. In terms of structure, I find that feedback on structure is usually quite useful. But poetry is such an intensely personal thing a lot of the time. I think it can be sometimes it's quite difficult to actually be able to take non-structural comment and actually make anything particularly useful of it, because usually the construction is something intensely personal. It reminds me very much of a favorite quote of mine by the artist Paul Gauguin, which is, "Do not finish your work too much. An impression is not sufficiently durable for its first freshness to survive a belated search for infinite detail. In this way, you let the lava grow cool." And I always loved that quote from Gauguin.
Pretty awesome quote, to be honest.
It's a beautiful quote, and the idea is that you've got to be, sometimes a poem can be, depending on the nature of it, it can be essentially a snapshot of the emotion that you had at the time or the event. And while I think the structure is important to look at to make sure that you're translating that full image in the most effective way, I think the comment that was made earlier is a really good one. I think it's quite difficult, it's quite dangerous to end up doing poetry by committee, because it strips it of any and all of its beautiful imperfections.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And I think there is a corollary from all this discussion that we're having, and it's something I'm sure Society of Classical Poets is moving towards. I know that I myself, with what I'm doing in my own poetry, am moving in this direction. And that is, of course, the need in the modern world to have the readings, recordings. So whether you have that as some sort of podcast, or whether you have that on a CD, or because people want to hear this stuff. They don't want to read it. In fact, the average person in the UK reads less than one book a year. I mean, it's just a staggeringly low reading take-up. Most people can't read, to be honest. They can just read emails and memos. They can't actually read, which is why when if you read to your wife who's got an English degree, that's one thing. But if your wife hasn't got an English degree, or your husband hasn't got an English degree, and you start using this kind of strange, seemingly archaic language, but it's not archaic, it's refreshing the language, but it's difficult for them to follow it because it's just not a straight line. It's not A to B. Poetry works through indirection. So actually what you have to have in a way is a live poetry reading of real stuff. and or recordings of real stuff where people can get hypnotized by listening to it in their car, in there doing something else. They turn it on and then this starts taking them over. So I think a big thing one has to do is actually get more sound, more harmony into the poetry.
I'm going to declare these two questions officially answered, and officially answered well. And I thank all of you for assisting.
Okay, well, I'm going to say, Mark, if you come again to another Zoom poetry reading and you raise them again, I'm going to ban you for life, okay? We've had
Fair enough. Fair enough. But let's not forget Susan's question.
Okay. Okay. What is your question, Susan?
I had a question about form. I'm really interested in form, and I just wondered if poets went out of their way to choose a form like a villanelle or a Shakespearean sonnet and then found the subject to fit the form, or whether they had the subject and looked to the form to showcase that subject in the best way, you know?
Yeah, I do know.
Like,
yeah.
I will write a villanelle, so I'll subject or...
Well, I'll kick off with one thing. You see, I think this is exactly like the question of free will and fate and God's predestination.
Yeah.
When your free will actually coincides with God's fate, then you meet your destiny. So when the poet, it's like, it's not one before the other, it's almost two simultaneously. You actually find the form as the subject itself is actually being uncovered and discovered and revealed in it. It's a weird thing. You can, of course, intellectually say, I'm going to write a sonnet. It
Yes.
may or may not be good, but often with the really great ideas, they come in forms. They come to you in forms. You can be inspired by Longfellow, by Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, or anybody else. But, you know, these things come to us and it's like, you know, they're right at a sort of, I'm going to use the word myself now, at a kind of soul level. At a kind of soul level, it's speaking to you. And that is the genius of form, because when the soul is speaking to you, or what I call the muse speaks through the soul, then, of course, the more difficult the form, the more brilliant the poem's going to be, because the difficulty isn't a difficulty when the soul is speaking, because the soul can solve all these problems. The brain can't solve it, the ego can't solve it. It just creates monotonous verse. But the muse speaking to the soul can solve any problem. We've only got to look at Dante, Milton, Shakespeare to see what they're capable of. This is, and not to mention the ancients. I mean, it's quite staggering. And we must never think, well, they did it then, we can't do it now. No, on the contrary, we are on the cusp of a renaissance in poetry. So it's our job, it's our duty to find the muse, to let the muse speak, and to have these incredibly complicated forms, which actually coincide with our choice, and then we meet our destiny.
What an amazing answer, James. I couldn't have wanted for better.
Good. That's excellent then. Well, I hope you're satisfied. And I hope you're going to continue to subscribe to the Society of Classical Poets and not give up on it. It would be very embarrassing as you're a winner. Okay, are there any more questions? Perhaps we should think about possibly letting people have the rest of the day to themselves. It's a Sunday. Jim's driving his car. He's amazing performance from Jim. His calmness, his focus, his concentration. He's hearing everything we're saying, and yet he's steering around that river.
Well, my wife, I'm on the passenger side in an American car.
Oh, right. I thought you were driving.
If I was in England, I would be, but not here.
Okay. Is there anything else anyone wants to say? Anything you want to say, Evan?
No, I mean, I don't know if anybody else wanted to answer Susan's question or not, but
I will. No, I will.
Amazing. Oh, okay.
Okay, so just three. Well, hold on. Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. My three thoughts are. Let's see. Well, okay. So if I'm thinking about a sonnet, well, there's got to be a turn somewhere in there. And maybe I just want to tell a story that doesn't have a turn. So maybe a sonnet's not the best way to go. Second thought is whether I go with trimeter or, like a iambic, it sometimes I'll come up with a wonderful, like a punchline, and it just sounds best in a particular meter. And then I'll write the rest of the poem around using that meter because I so like the punchline. or the meter of the punchline. And then my third thought is Trochaic Meter. I have a tough time reading that. And I actually have a Trochaic poem that I really like, but every time I perform it in public, I speak it, I have to sing it because, it's just easier to sing than it is to read, with the Trochaic Meter. And so, yeah, for me, Trochaic has got to be singable, or it ends up being singable. So those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, well, that's good. And that doesn't exclude the idea that, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you a question, Mark F. Stone. And the question I'm going to ask you is this. You're talking about this choice of trimeters, iambic, trochaics, whatever. But do you often find that, you're walking the dog, the Australian dog, and you're out, and suddenly a line comes to you. A line out of nowhere in a relaxed state comes to you, and you write it down immediately. And that becomes the germ for what is going to become the poem. Whether you work on it that day, whether you leave it a month or a year, that one line, and that line might be any of those things. And it might be a hybrid, and you think, well, that's a good line, but it's not quite right. So I'm going to work on it. And then the line itself could be short, could be long, starts dictating what the form is going to be. And it's come from the subconscious. That's a common experience for me.
Yes, that does happen. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to say, sorry, anything else?
I was going to just say, I think, the whole process of writing poetry, it's so mysterious because we know that it's both involves the right and left brain. I mean, there's that, like you mentioned, the subconscious, there are images, things that arise in our thoughts, but then we also know we want to give it structure and form. So there's and what I find I think this is the experience everyone's saying is oftentimes the germ of a poem begins with the first line. First line comes to you. And what I found helpful sometimes is in those initial moments when I'm getting an idea for a poem is to just brainstorm in terms of jotting down every image or snippet of verse, snippet of line, just brainstorm on paper. And those become like if you think of a watercolor painter, he first has his paints before him on the palette, and then he begins to paint with them. So you let the subconscious flow, as it were, and put out your images, and all on paper, and then you form it and give shape to it.
But you mentioned, Martin, the mystery of poetry, and it is a big mystery, as is every single human soul. The fact of the matter is we enter into society and we generalize, because we have to generalize, that people are like us and therefore they're experiencing things like us. But the reality is within the soul, actually, we're all in some sort of unique chamber. Unique chamber. And so how the poetry, and not just the poetry, but everything else too, the love and everything else in our life, but how the poetry is generated, I think you can put down general guidelines, but you would never cover all eventualities, which is why the lives of the poets are always so intriguing, because we find how they came to write their best poetry seems so different every time we look at it. So we can be prescriptive up to a point, but we need to bear in mind each individual is truly an individual and has a godlike capacity in their own kind of chamber of the soul. And that, I think, is a great freeing kind of concept. So we don't have to feel I've got to do this because so-and-so does it like this.
No, even our own experience, we come up with poems in different ways. It's not always the same pattern.
Exactly so. Exactly.
If I could just say one thing, if I could just add one thought. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I think back in the Elizabethan era, I once read that it was common in the court for people to speak in iambic pentameter. It was such a part of their cultural identity that they spoke that. I think as poets, we have a default that we tend to form in our minds, in maybe a sonnet form or something that we tend to start thinking in one way that's more natural to us. I find I do not think naturally in a villanelle or a rondeau. If I'm going to write a villanelle or a rondeau, I have to think. I am going to write a villanelle and then adapt a thought or a thing to that form. It doesn't come naturally to me. But other forms come more naturally, and that's my default. So I'm trying to respond to Susan's question about form.
Yeah.
So certain forms have to be consciously pursued others form more naturally from my experience, and that's how it is.
That's very, very true. But I'd ask you a question myself, James, which is that if you were to go back and look at your poems and put them into two categories, your best and the not the best, which of those best has actually come, as you would say, naturally, and which of those you've actually worked at? If the ones you've had to work at, you see, Ben Jonson had to keep working at it, and he produced some wonderful poems. Shakespeare apparently didn't have to work on it, and Ben Jonson criticised him. He should have blotted loads of his lines, because he did write some dreadful lines, but he also wrote lots of things naturally that seemed to flow from him that were great. So there's not one way of doing it, but it's actually identifying in ourselves what in ourselves is the most productive way of doing this. And by the way, you talked about sonnets and stuff, but you know, Stephen Fry in his book on poetry, the Ode Less Travelled, made the point that really to be able to write a sonnet was almost a passport of any true poet, that they could write a sonnet. And then we need to bear in mind that in the 18th century, hardly any poets wrote sonnets at all. So what we're talking about, that's a cultural shift. You know, the forms we choose have got cultural signification. So, you know, why was it that Pope and Dryden and Dr. Johnson didn't write sonnets? You know, and why do we write sonnets? And why has there been vogues for it and it goes in and out of vogue? Over time, yes, it's a major form. I don't dispute that for 1 second. But there's been a whole century where in English literature, people weren't writing sonnets. Now, that's a really strange structural thing. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about. But anyway, we're getting onto the history of literature here. But yeah, yes, I think with Evan, I think I've thrashed this out with all these wonderful people. Thank you all for being fabulous poets, fabulous readers, fabulous listeners to this event. I hope you'll come to the next one. And Evan, over to you to close down, I think.
I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much, James, for hosting. Unless anybody has anything else to add, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, of course.
Yes, Merry New Year. Make Christmas a verb. Don't forget Mark F. Stone.
And Free Fallen Gong, yes.
God bless you all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.